Chuck Evans is a 56-year-old black veteran, a man who once led top-secret Navy SEAL missions deep behind enemy lines, a man whose name appears in no public record, whose victories were never meant to be known. Today, though Chuck isn't on a battlefield, he's sitting quietly at a corner table in a small-town restaurant called Salt and Cedar, dressed in his old military jacket, just hoping to enjoy a simple meal. But that's where everything goes wrong. A racist restaurant manager spots Chuck, sneers at his worn clothes, and humiliates him in front of a room full of diners, mocking his appearance, questioning whether he belongs there, and shoving his veteran's ID aside as if it means nothing. The customers watch in stunned silence. No one steps in. No one knows the truth. They are watching a man who once commanded life-or-death missions, a man trained to stand his ground against the worst, a man who right now is deciding whether to rise or to stay silent. What follows triggers a chain reaction. No one could have predicted federal agents appear. Cameras capture the confrontation. The internet explodes. And suddenly Chuck Evans's name becomes a rallying cry across the country. But here's the question. You need to ask yourself, what would you have done in that restaurant? Would you have looked away? Or would you have stood beside him? Where are you watching this story from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and get ready because this is a story you won't forget. The midday sun bore down mercilessly on the upscale facade of Salt and Cedar, its polished windows gleaming the gold-lettered sign immaculate above the double doors. Yet on the sidewalk, a small crowd was gathering. Their heads, turning phones, rising eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Charles Chuck Evans, a tall black man in his mid-50s, stood stone still just beyond the threshold, his hands calmly at his sides, his military jacket worn but clean, contrasted sharply against the chic tailored suits and designer dresses brushing past him. Across the entrance, the restaurant's manager, Ethan Klein, flushed with anger, jabbed a finger toward the street. "I said out now. We don't need your kind loitering here." His voice cut through the lunch rush noise, sharp enough to make diners inside pause mid-bite. Lisa, a young waitress, hovered nearby, eyes wide, her tray trembling slightly. She'd taken Chuck's order minutes earlier, a simple meal. Nothing flashy. But now she stood frozen as her boss raised his voice louder. A group at an outdoor table snickered, one young man raising his phone to capture the moment. Chuck didn't flinch. His dark eyes remained steady, his expression unreadable as the camera lens zoomed in. A hush seemed to settle over the sidewalk. People passing by slowed, sensing something out of place. The young man with the phone chuckled, narrating to his followers. "Man, you guys seeing this? Some homeless dude trying to eat at Salt and Cedar Wild." The phone wobbled slightly as the camera tried to catch Chuck's face, and for a brief second the veteran's gaze locked onto the lens. There was no shame there, no panic, just a steady, weary endurance. It was the look of a man who had been through worse many times over and knew exactly how to stand his ground without lifting a finger. Inside behind the glass, diners whispered. A woman in pearls glanced from Chuck to Klein, then back to her salad. A suited man across the room raised his brow but said nothing. Klein, meanwhile, was working himself up, his face red, his words sharp. "You are never welcome here, Evans. I don't care if you ordered coffee or a steak. You're making people uncomfortable. Take it somewhere else." Lisa opened her mouth as if to protest, but a single glare from Klein silenced her. Chuck's shoulders straightened slightly, his eyes never leaving Klein. From the edge of the crowd, a second phone lifted. Another angle, another recording. The tension on the street thickened, a live drama unfolding with an audience of strangers. Someone muttered, "What the hell did he even do?" Another answered, "Beats me, just sat down like anyone else." A woman nearby whispered, "Is he drunk?" No one knew, but the story was already shaping itself online as the young man streaming grinned. "This is gonna blow up, I swear." Chuck finally took a slow breath, his chest rising under the faded fabric of his jacket, He shifted his weight slightly, not to run, not to threaten, but simply to stand more comfortably. His silence was unnerving. Klein, who jabbed his finger again. I said, "Leave. Don't make me call the police." Chuck's mouth curved just slightly. Not a smile, not quite a smirk. More an acknowledgement that he'd heard these words many times before, from many kinds of men in many different places. His fingers twitched once, almost imperceptibly, brushing against the edge of his pocket. Suddenly, Lisa stepped forward, her voice tight. "Mr. Klein, please, he paid. I took the order. He's not doing anything wrong." Klein turned on her sharply. "Stay out of this." Lisa. The young waitress swallowed hard. Stepping back, the crowd outside pressed in closer, their murmurs rising. Another camera came up. Chuck's eyes flicked to it briefly, then back to Klein. He could see it all playing out, the footage, the online chatter, the assumptions, the labels, a homeless man, a troublemaker. A nobody. The heat from the pavement radiated upward, making the air ripple slightly. Chuck raised his hand, not in surrender, not in anger, but to calmly adjust the strap on his jacket. His fingers grazed the small American flag pin near his collarbone, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, if not for the cameras now zooming in. A voice in the crowd muttered, "Wait, is that a military jacket?" Someone whispered back. "Looks like it. Didn't think they'd treat a vet like that." The camera caught it all. Klein's flaring temper, Lisa's worried glances, the tightening ring of onlookers, and at the center, Chuck steady, unmoving, unbothered. The young man with the phone leaned closer, excitement in his voice. "Yo, guys, you seeing this? Look at his face, man. He's not even blinking." The shot wobbled again, focusing on Chuck's eyes, those calm, unyielding eyes staring back through the lens. This wasn't the look of a man defeated. This was the look of someone measuring the moment, calculating. And that was when the mood shifted. For those watching live, the question simmered in every comment thread, every whispered conversation. "What's going on here? Who is this guy? Why is he being thrown out like a criminal?" The tension on the sidewalk crackled, ready to snap. And then just as Klein took another aggressive step forward, just as Lisa's hand flew to her mouth in worry, just as the crowd collectively held its breath, Chuck reached slowly into his pocket, not for money, not for keys, but for a battered old flip phone. His thumb hovered over the keypad for just a second. What happened next would change everything, but to understand how it all began, you have to go back a few minutes earlier inside the restaurant before the confrontation boiled over, before the cameras, before the crowd, before Chuck Evans quietly walked into Salt and Cedar, ordered lunch, and became the man at the center of a storm he never asked for. Inside Salt and Cedar, the midday light filtered gently through tall windows, casting sharp lines across the polished floorboards. The scent of roasted duck and fresh herbs filled the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of silverware. Charles Chuck Evans stepped quietly through the entrance. His military jacket modest but clean boots, worn but sturdy, he moved with a deliberate calm, eyes steady as he scanned the room for a seat. His presence turned a few heads, not because he made a scene, but because he did not fit the polished, curated image. The restaurant worked so hard to maintain Lisa. A young waitress with sharp eyes and a quick smile spotted him first. She didn't hesitate. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted, leading him to a table by the window. "Can I get you something to drink?" Chuck gave a quiet nod. "Coffee black. And the lunch special." Please, Lisa's pen moved swiftly. "Coming right up." She moved off and Chuck settled in, resting his hands lightly on the table. He didn't fidget, didn't scan the room nervously. Instead, he gazed calmly out the window, watching people drift by on the sidewalk. Across the room from behind the bar, Ethan Klein watched. His narrowed eyes tracked Lisa as she served Chuck with the same politeness she gave every other customer. Klein, always a stickler, for appearances, disliked anything that might disrupt his restaurant's image. His mouth tightened as he took in the details. The jacket, the boots, the faintly military bearing. Klein leaned over, muttering something to the bartender, who glanced once toward Chuck before going back to polishing glasses. Lisa soon returned, placing the coffee carefully in front of Chuck. "Your food will be out shortly," she said, smiling. Chuck offered a soft, "Thank you," lifting the cup in both hands, savoring its warmth. Around him, the restaurant buzzed on small groups of well-dressed diners chatting laughter from a nearby table, the occasional rustle of a newspaper. Yet under the surface, a tension was coiling unnoticed by most, but growing sharper by the second. Klein smoothed his tie and stepped out from behind the bar. His steps were unhurried, his face carefully arranged in a polite expression, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He crossed the floor, moving directly to Chuck's table. Stopping just beside the window, Chuck looked up calmly, his expression open but unreadable. "Excuse me," Sir Klein began, voice smooth but edged. "Do you have a reservation today?" His tone carried a practiced civility, the kind that could easily flip into something colder. Chuck's gaze didn't flicker. "No," he answered simply. There were open tables. His voice was quiet, steady, not defensive. Klein gave a tight smile, eyes glinting. "Ah, well, we usually recommend a reservation, especially for special guests." The pause hung heavy, the implication unmistakable. A man at a nearby table lowered his fork slightly, glancing over Lisa standing near the kitchen door, shifted her weight, worry flickering across her face. Chuck, still calm, reached slowly into his jacket, pulling out a slim, worn leather wallet. He slid a small card onto the table without a word. Klein leaned in slightly, his smile never reaching his eyes. Picking up the card between two fingers, he examined it, tilting it toward the light. The faint lettering read, "Department of Veterans Affairs." Chuck waited, hands folded loosely on the table, eyes resting lightly on Klein's face. There was a small, sharp silence. Klein's mouth curled just slightly. He set the card back down on the table, a little too casually, a little too dismissively. "Military, huh?" he said softly, his voice almost amused. "Well, thank you for your service, I guess." The last word hung in the air, laced with just enough disdain to be unmistakable. Lisa took a hesitant step forward, eyes darting between the two men, but Chuck gave the faintest shake of his head. Not yet. Not worth it. He reached for his coffee again, lifting it calmly to his lips, sipping slowly. The room had not yet noticed, but the tension at this table was thickening by the second. Klein remained where he was, shifting his weight arms, folding slowly across his chest. His eyes flicked briefly toward the register, then back to Chuck, narrowing slightly. His stance was that of a man who had decided firmly that something was out of place, and that he alone would correct it. Outside the window, a pair of teenagers passed, laughing at something on a phone. Inside, the laughter was thinner, the buzz of conversation losing its easy flow. A woman 2 tables away glanced over her shoulder, eyebrows rising faintly. She did not know what she was watching, but she knew it was worth watching. Chuck set the coffee cup down again, the faint clink of porcelain against saucer barely audible over the growing quiet. His face remained impassive, his posture relaxed, but there was an edge beneath his calm, a quiet readiness that only a few in the room might have recognized. The air around the table had shifted. Lisa drew in a breath, as if to speak, then thought better of it. Klein's mouth tightened further, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Now, for a moment, no one spoke. Then deliberately, Klein leaned in just slightly, his smile sharpening. The first sign that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Klein's smirk hardened as he straightened his back, folding his arms in front of his chest. The room, which had once hummed with the quiet rhythm of clinking glasses and murmured conversation, was now dipped in a strange hush. Chuck Evans, still seated, watched the man silently, his hands resting loosely on the table. The VA card sat between them like a small, unimportant token, already dismissed. "You really think that little card means anything here?" Klein's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from surrounding tables. You think that gets you a free pass to sit wherever you want, drink coffee, waste space in my restaurant. His tone shifted, sharpening like a blade being tested. This place has standards, you know. We don't just let anyone sit and pretend they belong. A man at a table near the window paused, fork halfway to his mouth, while his companion leaned in, whispering. At another table, a woman subtly raised her phone camera lens, glinting under the ceiling lights. Lisa stood frozen near the kitchen door, fingers nervously gripping the edge of her apron, eyes flicking anxiously between Klein and Chuck. Chuck remained still, his gaze locked on Klein, his expression neutral, unreadable. He didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't justify, but his silence only seemed to fuel Klein's need to dominate the moment. I mean, look at you. Klein continued, gesturing broadly at Chuck's boots, his worn jacket, his quiet presence. You don't fit here. This isn't a halfway house. You probably thought you could just sit, blend in, maybe skip the bill. But that's not how this works. His voice grew louder, drawing a ripple of murmurs from diners now openly watching the scene unfold. Lisa took a tentative step forward. Mr. Klein, she said carefully, her voice shaking slightly. He already paid. I took his order. He's not causing any trouble. Klein turned sharply, his tone snapping like a whip. Lisa, I told you this doesn't concern you. His eyes narrowed as he faced Chuck again, lips curling into a mocking smile. You know what's funny? Guys like you always think waving a veteran's card gets you some kind of special treatment. But it doesn't. Not here, not with me. A nearby diner shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath. Another reached casually for his phone, angling it toward the confrontation. Lisa's mouth opened again, but Chuck gave the faintest shake of his head. Not yet. Not now. Chuck's hands moved slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushing the surface of the table. He tapped once, twice, as if deciding whether to speak or stand. But then, without a word, his right hand slid calmly into his jacket pocket. The movement was smooth, practiced, unhurried, but it was enough to catch Klein's attention. The manager's brow furrowed slightly, his mouth tightening. Hey, Klein snapped, what do you think you're doing? Chuck didn't answer. He pulled out a small battered flip phone, the kind long forgotten in a world of smartphones and apps. Its scratched surface caught the overhead light briefly as Chuck flipped it open with one thumb. His fingers moved with quiet precision, pressing a speed dial button as if it were second nature. Lisa let out a small breath, eyes wide. Several diners leaned forward, curiosity flickering across their faces. The young woman near the window whispered, "Who's he calling?" "Someone else," murmured. "Is he calling the cops?" But Chuck gave no clues. He didn't look at Lisa, didn't look at Klein, didn't glance at the growing number of phones now discreetly recording. His eyes stayed locked forward, calm and unwavering as the line connected. The restaurant seemed to contract slightly. The air pulled tighter, as if the entire room was leaning in to catch the next move. Klein shifted uneasily, the confident swagger in his stance flickering just slightly. Chuck raised the phone to his ear, his voice low, barely above a murmur but carrying enough weight to settle over the tension like a heavy stone. "It's me," he said quietly. He didn't add more. He didn't need to. The words themselves, simple, understated, carried a strange magnetic pull, as if the man speaking them was not just calling for help, but signaling the start of something far larger. The hook settled hard. Every diner watching every phone, capturing the moment, every whispered conversation wondered the same thing. Who had he just called? Chuck closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. The flip phone still pressed calmly to his ear. Klein shifted again, uncertainty creeping into his posture. Despite the arrogant mask, he struggled to keep in place. Lisa's hands trembled slightly, her eyes darting toward the door, as if expecting something or someone to walk through at any second. And as the tension reached its peak, the line on the phone clicked softly, connecting fully. Without raising his voice, without breaking his calm, Chuck spoke two quiet words. "It's time." The room held its breath. What none of them knew was that a silent chain reaction had just been triggered, and everything was about to change. Chuck lowered the flip phone, slowly setting it calmly beside his coffee cup, as if the room weren't holding its collective breath. His quiet words, "Activate Alpha Protocol," had landed softly, but carried the strange, heavy pull of something bigger now in motion. Klein narrowed his eyes, forcing a laugh, his voice rising as he gestured toward the surrounding tables. "What was that, huh?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "You calling the cops? Calling your lawyer? Go ahead, call whoever you want. You think I'm scared of you." His laughter came sharper now, tinged with a nervous energy he hadn't had moments before. Chuck didn't move. He adjusted his jacket slightly, smoothing the fabric near his wrist, his expression neutral, his body language quiet but unreadable. Across the room, diners leaned in, forks resting against plates, phones discreetly lifted to catch the unfolding moment. They didn't know exactly what they were witnessing, but they could all sense the shift the moment when the air thickened, when the easy balance of power tilted off-center. Klein stepped in closer. "Pushing his advantage, I don't care who you called," he said loudly, eyes flicking toward the front windows as if expecting to see flashing lights. "You think some phone call's going to change anything here? This is my house. I decide who stays and who goes. You should remember that before you play tough old man." His words rang sharp and cutting, bouncing off the polished walls, making several diners wince involuntarily. Chuck remained perfectly still, his hands loose, resting lightly by his sides, his eyes steady on Klein. There was no trace of anger on his face, no flare of indignation, only a calm patience, like someone who understood a game Klein hadn't even realized they were playing. A soft scrape echoed nearby as a chair shifted. A diner near the window leaned forward slightly, phone camera rising, capturing every second. At a corner table, an older man adjusted his seating position, angling his camera with subtle care. His face was sharp, alert, not the expression of a random diner, but of someone who recognized signals. Someone who had seen a shift like this before and knew to keep recording. His lips tightened, but he said nothing, his fingers steady as they gripped the phone. Klein huffed out another sharp breath, his nerves fraying at the edges even as he tried to hold on to his swagger. "You hear me?" he barked. "You're nothing here. You think one call makes you important. You think waving that card at me makes you matter." He snorted, shaking his head again. "You're just another washed-up vet trying to play hero. I've seen plenty like you." Chuck blinked once, slow and steady, then exhaled softly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for a very long time. He glanced briefly towards the front window, then back at Klein, his expression unchanged. The restaurant fell into a strange, heavy quiet. Every conversation stilled, every eye drawn toward the two men at the center of the storm. And then outside, the sound of an engine cut sharply through the stillness. A sleek black SUV rounded the corner at speed, its darkened windows reflecting the sunlight as it surged toward the front of the restaurant. The tires gripped hard, the vehicle sliding smoothly into a sharp stop at the curb, the soft chirp of rubber against pavement breaking the hush inside Salt and Cedar diners jerked their heads toward the window, whispers breaking loose like a snapped thread. Klein's mouth worked once, then again, but no words came. His eyes flicked from the SUV to Chuck, then back, confusion flickering across his face. The older man at the corner table leaned forward slightly, his camera zooming in the faintest knowing smile tugging at his mouth. Inside the restaurant, Chuck shifted just enough to roll his shoulders back, standing a little straighter. His hands remained loose, his breathing calm, his presence utterly controlled. He glanced toward Klein once more, his voice quiet but steady. "You might want to step back." Klein barked a short, bitter laugh, trying to recenter himself. "Step back. Who the hell do you think you are giving me orders in my own place?" His voice cracked slightly at the edges, and the diners caught it. The cameras caught it. The old man recording in the corner caught it. The SUV idled at the curb, its engine humming low and steady. Without hurry, the rear door swung open, a tall figure stepping smoothly onto the sidewalk, adjusting the cuff of a dark suit, His movements were efficient, precise. Not the casual stride of a customer, but the measured approach of someone trained for control. Inside, every phone turned to the door. Every whisper fell silent. Every diner felt the hook pull tight. What none of them knew was that whoever was stepping through those doors next was not there to eat, not there to chat, and certainly not there for Ethan Klein. The door to Salt and Cedar swung open with a quiet authority that needed no announcement. Diners instinctively leaned back, chairs scraping softly against the polished floors as two sharply dressed men entered, their movements crisp and practiced. They wore dark suits, no visible badges, but everything about their posture screamed federal, the kind of presence that made ordinary people go silent without being told. The taller of the two scanned the room, briefly eyes narrowing as they locked on Ethan Klein, still frozen near Chuck Evans's table. A beat later, another figure stepped inside, adjusting the cuff of his jacket as he moved. His presence filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with size. Mark Sorrell, Assistant Director of the Department of Justice, moved not like a man looking for a meal, but like someone here to settle something overdue. His eyes swept over Klein, dismissing the diners, dismissing the cameras, focusing only on the target. Klein's smirk was gone. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. His shoulders stiffened, his hands hovered awkwardly at his sides, who he managed to choke out, but Sorrell cut him off with a quiet, lethal efficiency. Assistant Director, Sorrell, Department of Justice. His ID case snapped open, the seal unmistakable. You are currently in violation of multiple federal civil rights statutes. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Gasps rippled through the diners, whispers slicing across tables. Phones that had been tentatively filming were now raised openly, capturing every second. A woman at a back table murmured, "Oh my God," her eyes wide as she nudged her companion. Near the corner, the older man with the camera leaned in slightly, a satisfied gleam in his eye as he captured it all. Klein stumbled back a step, color draining from his face. This is just a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking. "We were just, He gestured wildly toward Chuck, but Sorrell's sharp gaze stopped him. Cold. "You were harassing a decorated veteran, a private citizen without cause," Sorrell said calmly, his voice cutting through Klein's panic. "We have the entire incident on open channel monitoring. This is no longer your decision to manage." The hook tightened when Sorrell finally turned toward Chuck, his posture relaxing slightly, a flicker of something warmer, respect, maybe even nostalgia, softening his sharp features. "Good to see you again, Colonel Evans," he said, his voice quieter now, but still carrying across the room. "It's been a long time, sir." The room collectively froze. Phones that had been filming jittered slightly as hands trembled with sudden realization. A teenager near the window whispered into his live stream. "Wait, Colonel, did he just say Colonel Evans?" Someone else hissed. "He's military, he was in command." And then the realization hit not just a veteran, not just another ex-soldier, but a former Special Operations commander. Klein's jaw worked silently, his face blanching further. He stumbled again, his hands rising half-heartedly as if to ward off the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His eyes darted from Chuck to Sorrell to the watching crowd, the foundation of his arrogance crumbling by the second. Chuck gave a small nod, his face remaining calm, the flicker of a knowing smile barely tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need to say anything. The pieces were falling into place on their own. The crowd's whispers sharpened, mutating into hurried typing, urgent posting. A woman near the bar had already pushed out a tweet. A young man across the room grinned into his phone camera, whispering breathlessly, "Yo, TikTok is gonna eat this alive." Outside, the black SUV's engine idled patiently, its presence a reminder that the Department of Justice had not come for a polite conversation. Inside, Sorrell's team began moving one agent quietly, guiding Klein toward a side conversation, the other sweeping the room with a professional's eye, noting every camera, every recording device. Lisa hovered near the kitchen, her hands pressed flat against the counter, her breath catching as she tried to process what she was seeing. Around her, the diners had transformed from passive onlookers into live reporters pushing updates to social media as the scene unfolded in real time. Sorrell turned back toward Chuck, his voice lowering as he stepped closer. "We've been keeping an eye on things, sir," he said quietly. "You pulled the trigger on Alpha faster than we expected, but we're ready to move." Chuck nodded once, a silent agreement passing between the two men. They didn't need to explain. And just like that, the moment cracked open, not just in the room, but across the digital world. Phones vibrated as notifications poured in, hashtags began trending, and the small local confrontation inside Salt and Cedar ignited into something far larger. What had started as a humiliating moment between a veteran and a smug manager was now spiraling across the internet, across news feeds, across public consciousness. By the time Klein realized just how far he had fallen, it was already too late. His fate wasn't just in the hands of the men standing in front of him. It was in the hands of a million strangers watching, sharing, and judging. The first video hit TikTok less than 5 minutes after Sorrell flashed his badge. A shaky clip barely a minute long showed Klein's face draining of color as the Department of Justice agents surrounded him, followed by the unmistakable moment when Sorrell called Chuck Colonel Evans. Within an hour, the video racked up 500,000 views. Comments poured in like a flood. "Wait, he's special ops. Who the hell insults a SEAL commander in public? This man needs justice." On Twitter, hashtags ignited like wildfire. Justice for Chuck shot to trending within 2 hours, fueled by outrage shock and the addictive rush of a story too good to ignore. Posts stitched together, Chuck's quiet confrontation with Klein, slow-motion replays of Sorrell's entrance, and snippets of military records that sleuthing internet users began to uncover. Someone dug up a grainy old photograph, a younger Chuck, sand-streaked and battle-worn, standing shoulder to shoulder with 2 other SEALs in gear rifles, slung low exhaustion carved into their faces. The caption read, "Commander Charles Evans, Task Force Wolfhound, 2007. The internet didn't know what Task Force Wolfhound was, at least not at first. But once the name slipped out, the digging began in earnest. Reddit threads exploded with speculation. Military forums hummed with half-remembered whispers, and veteran groups on Facebook quietly confirmed what few civilians knew. Wolfhound had been one of the most secretive hostage recovery units in U.S. military history. Missions classified, files, redacted details buried. But among veterans, the stories survived, and Chuck Evans's name surfaced again and again, tied to ops that saved dozens of American lives far from home. By nightfall, YouTube channels were dissecting the Salt and Cedar footage frame by frame. Reaction videos popped up ranging from quiet analysis to furious rants. TikTok was flooded with duets, stitches, and commentary, many overlaying Chuck's quiet composure, with voiceovers calling him a hero, a legend, an icon of silent strength. The hashtags multiplied. Verfunster SEAL hero abused. Konstjärfumacher Wolfhound commander. We stand with Chuck. The digital tidal wave swept outward, pulling in everyone from political commentators to veterans advocacy groups to celebrities looking to boost a cause. Some called for legal action against Klein, others demanded recognition for Chuck. The Salt and Cedar's Google reviews plummeted overnight, its social media pages flooded with angry posts, 1-star ratings, and calls for a national boycott. Protesters gathered outside by morning small but determined holding signs that read, "Respect our veterans and we see you, Chuck Evans." Inside the restaurant, Chuck sat quietly at his usual table, sipping coffee as if the world outside hadn't turned upside down. He barely glanced at the window where news vans were now parked, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters hustling to get live coverage. Microphones flashed, cameras rolled. But Chuck didn't flinch. Sorrell had offered to move him to a secure location, but he'd declined. Lisa occasionally peeked out from behind the counter, eyes wide as crowds grew thicker by the hour. Chuck remained focused, not on the swirling headlines or the growing chants outside, but on the simple, grounded reality in front of him. He had survived worse storms than social media outrage. Fame meant nothing to him. He had never sought it. The faces outside weren't what mattered, not the influencers or the news anchors or the trending hashtags. What mattered were the veterans now speaking up, the men and women posting stories of their own, the quiet admissions in comment sections and group chats. I served under him. He saved our team. That man got my brother home alive. We owe him. Chuck's name was no longer just drifting across Twitter feeds. It was anchored in the collective memory of those who understood the price of service, the weight of sacrifice, the meaning of quiet resilience. His story was no longer just about a bad manager or a viral video. It had become a rallying point, a flash of collective recognition, a rare moment when the internet chose to lift up someone, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. As the crowd outside swelled and the hashtags kept climbing, Chuck took another slow sip of his coffee, letting the noise slide past him. The next move belonged to the world. He had already done his part. By midday, the inside of Salt and Cedar no longer resembled a restaurant. Reporters crowded shoulder to shoulder. Camera crews jostled for space. Microphones stretched over each other like a tangled sea of arms, and flashbulbs popped relentlessly. The din of voices filled every corner, overlapping questions and urgent updates feeding into live broadcasts. Customers who had been there when it all began were now either pressed to the walls or watching wide-eyed from their seats, their half-finished meals cold on the tables. Chuck sat calmly at his booth, unmoved by the chaos surrounding him. His hands rested lightly on the table, his gaze steady, his demeanor as composed as if none of it were happening. Across the room, Mark Sorrell stood in front of a wall of cameras, his crisp, dark suit immaculate, his face sharp and controlled. Sorrell raised his voice just enough to be heard clearly above the noise. The Department of Justice, he announced, is formally closing this establishment, pending a full investigation into civil rights violations and discrimination practices. His eyes swept the crowd, landing briefly on Klein, whose face had drained of all color. This is not a media stunt. This is not theater. Let me make it clear to everyone watching, discrimination will be met with accountability, and no institution, no matter how small, is exempt from the law. The effect was immediate. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, cameras zooming in tighter, microphones jabbed toward Sorrell's face as they tried to seize every word, every statement, every headline-worthy quote. Near the bar, Lisa stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, her eyes darting between Sorrell and Chuck, unsure whether to cry, cheer, or simply hide. But the center of the storm was Klein. The once arrogant manager crumbled before the cameras, his voice breaking as he stumbled forward, his hands raised in a wild, panicked gesture. "This is a misunderstanding," he shouted, eyes wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It was just a mistake. I didn't mean, I didn't know." His words collapsed on themselves, falling into incoherent babble as the weight of the moment crushed whatever bluster he had left. The reporters turned, sensing blood in the water, microphones swinging toward Klein, now questions firing like bullets. "Were you aware of Chuck Evans's military record? Did you target him because he's a veteran? Have you harassed other customers?" Klein flailed, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled to answer, his voice rising in panicked denial. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't supposed to." Through it all, Chuck remained still when a reporter finally turned toward him, shoving a microphone inches from his face. The question came fast and breathless. "Colonel Evans, do you have any comment? Do you want to respond to what's happened here today?" Chuck's eyes lifted, calm and clear, the faintest trace of a tired smile tugging at his lips. He shook his head once, a simple, quiet refusal, and stood without a word, without a glance at the cameras or the shouting reporters or the collapsing figure of Klein. Chuck Evans turned and walked out of the restaurant, his footsteps steady, his posture straight. For a heartbeat, the entire room stilled, cameras swiveling to follow Chuck's retreating figure, reporters momentarily stunned by the lack of a soundbite, the absence of a grand statement. But that quiet only lasted a moment, because outside the roar was still building. What no one inside Salt and Cedar realized, not yet, was that this story was far from over. It wasn't just about a restaurant, a manager, or even one man's dignity. It had tapped into something deeper, something raw and national, something that was only just beginning to ignite. In the dim light of his small rented room, Chuck Evans sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his hands resting on his knees, the faint hum of the ceiling fan filling the quiet space. The television, an old model perched on a shaky dresser, flickered with news coverage of Salton Cedar, the scrolling headlines announcing federal investigations, public outrage, and endless social media reactions. Chuck barely looked at it. His phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. He reached for it, answering with a simple, steady, "Yeah." On the other end, Mark Sorrell's voice carried a mixture of amusement and exhaustion. Colonel Evans Sorrell said the title, coming out as a half-sigh, half-smile. "You should know the offers are already rolling in." Chuck raised an eyebrow slightly, though no one could see it. "Offers?" he repeated quietly. Sorrell chuckled. "Housing programs, government grants, nonprofit partnerships. A congressman wants to shake your hand on camera. There's talk of a ceremony, maybe even a medal. You've lit a fire, sir. People want to reward you." Chuck leaned back slightly, his eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling paint. "No," he said simply. "I don't want a house bought for headlines. I don't need a medal for sitting through another bad day." There was a pause on the line, Sorrell processing the weight of those words. "You know," Sorrell murmured, "you've shifted the conversation, right? People are watching. People are asking questions they weren't asking yesterday." Chuck exhaled softly, his hand running across the back of his neck. "Good," he said after a moment. "But it can't just be about me. I'm not the only one who's been overlooked, pushed aside, told to wait. If they want to honor someone, let them start seeing the rest." Sorrell was quiet for a moment, the line carrying only the faint sounds of his office in the background. Then his voice returned lower. "Now, you're aware, sir, that you just changed the game?" Chuck gave a quiet, tired chuckle. "Mark, I never wanted the game." As the call ended, Chuck set the phone back on the nightstand, his fingers lingering on its worn surface. His eyes drifted toward the window, where the city's faint glow seeped through the thin curtains. He sat there for a long moment, letting the silence wrap around him, a quiet space untouched by news feeds, cameras, or headlines. Outside his door, the world churned on reporters drafting follow-ups, activists organizing events, veterans groups launching fundraisers. Chuck remained still, his presence in the storm's center marked not by noise but by an unwavering calm. He reached for a glass of water, taking a slow sip, his thoughts turning not to his own face on a screen, but to the countless others still sitting in shadows, waiting to be seen. Then a soft sound broke the quiet, the faint metallic click of the apartment building's mailbox lid shutting below. Chuck's brow furrowed slightly. He stood moving with the slow, deliberate ease of a man whose joints carried the memory of years crossing the room and stepping into the narrow hallway. Downstairs, the small row of mailboxes gleamed dully under the flickering hall light. Chuck reached his, twisting the key with a soft scrape. Inside, among the usual stack of bills and flyers, was a single envelope, its heavy paper stamped with the unmistakable seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Chuck turned it over slowly in his hands, the weight of it unfamiliar, yet strangely grounding. He ran a thumb along the edge, feeling the slight texture, the official embossing. Whatever the envelope contained, it wasn't a thank you card or a public gesture. It was something meant directly for him. He slipped it under his arm, climbed the stairs back to his room, and sat once more on the edge of the bed. The television still buzzed in the background, the world outside still roaring with opinions, hashtags, and headlines. But Chuck's focus was elsewhere now, his fingers carefully sliding under the flap of the envelope, pulling it open with the precision of a man who understood that some messages required full attention. Whatever the letter contained, it would not be the end of his story. Only the next step. Chuck glanced once toward the muted television screen, then back at the letter in his lap. Slowly, steadily, he rose to his feet. There was no press conference, no speech, no headline waiting to be written. There was just a man holding a letter preparing to face the community that had finally begun to remember who he was. The morning air outside Salt and Cedar was crisp, unusually still after weeks of chaos and headlines. Gone were the reporters, the crowds, the protest signs. In their place stood a quieter scene, a freshly painted doorway, a new name on the glass, and the low hum of a restaurant preparing for a normal day. Chuck Evans stood at the edge of the sidewalk, his hands in the pockets of his worn jacket, his eyes taking in the familiar space with a calm, steady gaze. Inside the restaurant buzzed with quiet morning activity. Lisa, still working under the new ownership, moved smoothly between tables, balancing plates with practiced ease. The new owner, a stocky man with a kind face and sleeves rolled up past his elbows, paused to greet regulars, his laughter carrying gently over the soft clatter of cutlery. Conversations rose and fell, the usual rhythm of an ordinary breakfast crowd. When Chuck stepped through the door, the shift was immediate. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Even the new owner, who hadn't been part of the previous storm, straightened instinctively, sensing the weight that had just entered his space. Lisa froze for half a heartbeat before a small, genuine smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Chuck walked to the center of the room, stopping just shy of his usual table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture for attention, but the room quieted around him anyway, the way air seems to still before a storm. Slowly, steadily, he let his eyes sweep across the space, not in accusation, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement. "I didn't come here today for an apology." Chuck said, his voice low but carrying easily to every corner. "I came to remind you of something." His gaze settled on no one in particular, and yet seemed to touch everyone. "People like me, veterans, workers, the invisible ones you pass every day, we don't need your pity, and we don't need you to tell us we matter after the headlines have faded." He let the silence stretch a second longer, his expression calm, measured. "We need you to remember we exist before the cameras show up. We need you to look at us, really look and know we're part of this place, part of this community. Not just when it's convenient, not just when it's trending." No one spoke. A spoon clinked softly against a coffee cup somewhere near the back, and then even that sound faded. Some diners lowered their eyes, uncomfortable. Others shifted slightly in their seats. The new owner stood quietly behind the counter, his hands resting lightly on its edge, absorbing the weight of the words without flinching. Chuck gave a small nod, as if concluding a private thought, then turned to go. But just as he reached the door, a small voice called out softly. Sir Chuck turned. A young boy no older than 8 or 9 hurried forward, clutching a small folded piece of paper in both hands. His cheeks were pink with nervousness, his shoes scuffing softly against the floor as he stopped just in front of Chuck, eyes wide and earnest. "I wanted to give you this," the boy said. Holding out the note with both hands, Chuck accepted it carefully, unfolding the paper with slow, deliberate fingers. Inside, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were the simple words, "Thank you for being brave." For the first time that morning, Chuck's expression shifted. His shoulders softened slightly, the faintest glimmer of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. He crouched slightly, meeting the boy's eyes level. "Thank you," Chuck said quietly. "That means a lot." The boy beamed, then scurried back to his table where his mother watched with misty eyes. Chuck straightened, folding the note carefully and slipping it into his pocket. He let out a long breath, glancing once more around the room. This wasn't about making a speech or finishing a headline moment. It was about planting something, a thought, a memory that might last longer than a news cycle. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, the sun catching the edges of his jacket, Chuck knew one thing clearly: his work wasn't done yet. There was still something left to do, and this time it wouldn't just be about his story. It would be about the others, the quiet ones waiting to be seen. The classroom smelled faintly of pencil shavings and glue, sunlight spilling across rows of eager young faces. Chuck Evans sat at the front, slightly hunched in the too small chair meant for children. His hands folded loosely in his lap. The teacher, a kind-eyed woman in her early 30s, stood quietly to one side, smiling softly as her students leaned forward, hanging on every word. Chuck wasn't here to talk about battles or medals. He wasn't here to tell stories of classified missions or dangerous rescues. Instead, he spoke gently about things far simpler, and in his mind far more important. You know. Chuck began his voice, calm but strong. When I was your age, I thought courage was about doing something big, something loud, something everyone would see. He smiled faintly, watching the rows of small faces watching him. But real courage, he continued, is often quiet. It's when you do the right thing, even if no one's watching. Even when it's hard, one little girl, her hair tied in 2 tight braids, raised her hand cautiously. "Like what, sir?" she asked softly. Chuck's eyes warmed as he leaned slightly forward, like standing up for someone who's alone, like helping someone even if your friends don't, like saying sorry when you've made a mistake. The room fell quiet, the weight of his words settling over the class in a way no flashy story ever could. Suddenly, a small boy near the front raised his hand, high, his brow furrowed with the seriousness only a child could carry. "Mister, were you ever scared?" Chuck chuckled softly, the sound low and genuine. "Yes," he said without hesitation. Many times, he rested his elbows lightly on his knees, locking eyes with the boy. But being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you stand up anyway, not because you don't feel fear, but because you know what's right. The classroom sat perfectly still for a moment, the children's wide eyes reflecting something deeper than just curiosity they were absorbing. Storing, turning his words over carefully in their young minds. The teacher caught Chuck's eye, offering a grateful nod, her expression touched. He gave her a small nod back, feeling the faintest ripple of satisfaction move through his chest. This wasn't about teaching them to fight or to win. It was about planting a seed that might grow into strength, patience, and quiet kindness. As the lesson wrapped up, the children clustered around, eager to shake his hand, some offering crayon drawings they had made during the week. Chuck accepted each one with gentle thanks, folding the pictures carefully before tucking them under his arm. The noise in the classroom rose again, laughter and chatter filling the air as the children gathered their things. Stepping into the hallway, Chuck paused for a moment, taking a slow breath, his eyes scanning the bright murals and art-covered walls. He understood what this moment meant. A small ripple of change, a chance to help shape how the next generation saw strength, saw fairness, saw the quiet fight for what mattered. But as he moved toward the exit, the noise of the outside world began creeping back in headlines. Tensions, the unsteady drum of a country still wrestling with the same old battles. Chuck adjusted his jacket, his shoulders straightening as he stepped out into the sunlight. He knew the truth. The fight in the real world never truly ended, and he was ready once again to face whatever waited. The evening air was cool as Chuck Evans sat on the small wooden chair on the front porch of his new apartment, a modest space recently provided through a veterans' housing program. The faint hum of the city echoed in the distance. Passing cars muffled conversations. A dog barking 2 streets over, Chuck sat quietly, elbows resting on his knees, watching the glow of the streetlights flicker across the sidewalk. He knew people were still watching. Across the street, half hidden by the shadow of a parked car, a photographer angled his lens, snapping shots from afar. Somewhere online, another article was probably going live, another headline about the hero veteran who had become a national symbol. Chuck exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. He hadn't asked for this attention. Inside on the small kitchen table sat a neat stack of folders. Job applications, housing referrals, contacts for other veterans who had quietly reached out since his story broke. Chuck had spent his days calling in favors, connecting the dots, doing what he could to help the men and women who were still slipping through the cracks. Not for cameras, not for applause. Just because it was the right thing to do. From his porch, he could hear faint voices from the neighboring units. Families settling in for the night, the clink of dishes being washed. A low laugh drifting from an open window. The building was filled with others like him, former soldiers, men and women carrying the weight of years of battles, fought both abroad and at home. Chuck leaned back slightly, eyes half closed, feeling the ache in his joints, the familiar pull of old injuries. He didn't mind the ache, he was used to carrying things. Suddenly a soft knock broke through the quiet. Chuck opened his eyes, glancing toward the front door. Another knock, slightly louder this time. He rose slowly, the chair creaking softly beneath him, and crossed the short distance to the entrance. When he opened the door, he found a man standing there, late 30s, worn clothes, eyes tired but determined. He hesitated, hands fidgeting slightly at his sides. "Mr. Evans," the man said quietly, his voice rough with hesitation. "I heard you help veterans. I didn't know who else to ask. I need help." Chuck didn't answer right away. He simply studied the man's face for a moment, reading the lines of exhaustion, the flicker of hope barely holding steady in his eyes. Without a word, Chuck stepped back slightly, holding the door open. The man let out a shaky breath, relief flooding his features as he stepped inside. Outside, the photographer across the street lowered his camera for a moment, watching silently as the front door closed. He had his shot, but he understood this part of the story wasn't for headlines. Inside the small apartment, Chuck sat back down at the kitchen table, reaching quietly for the stack of folders ready to begin again. He had accepted the role, the responsibility, the quiet weight that came with it, and he would carry it as he always had, without needing thanks, without needing to be seen. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the small park where folding chairs had been set up under the wide branches of an old oak tree. It wasn't an official event. No big sponsors, no government banners, no media crews, just a gathering of local veterans, their families, a few neighbors, and a small cluster of schoolchildren who had come to learn something real, something human. Chuck Evans stood quietly near the edge, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, watching as people milled about, sharing coffee in paper cups, clapping each other on the back, exchanging stories soft enough not to be overheard. A few faces turned toward him, smiling, nodding, offering a silent thanks. Chuck gave them small nods in return, content to stay on the edge away from the center. The event's organizer, an older veteran with silver hair and a voice like gravel, stepped up to the small wooden platform that had been assembled on the grass. He tapped the mic, gently clearing his throat. "I'm not going to make this long," he said, glancing at the modest crowd. "We're not here to hand out medals or make speeches. We're here because one of our own reminded us that we're still here. All of us. Not to be forgotten, not to be overlooked." He turned, gesturing lightly toward Chuck. "Chuck Evans, you didn't ask for this. You didn't want a parade or a headline, but you gave us something more important. You made us seen." The applause that followed was gentle, not thunderous, the kind of sound that came from genuine respect, not ceremony. Chuck stepped forward, slowly accepting a firm handshake from the organizer, feeling the quiet strength in the man's grip. Chuck's voice was steady low as he spoke. "I didn't do this to be seen," he said, glancing around the small circle of faces. "I did this because none of us should be forgotten. Not me, not you. Not the next one who comes home and wonders if anyone remembers they were here." There was a hush after he finished, a ripple of something deep moving through the gathered group. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even admiration. It was recognition. A young girl no more than 10 stepped hesitantly forward, her small hand clutching a simple point-and-shoot camera. "Can we take a picture?" she asked softly, eyes wide. Chuck smiled faintly, nodding. The veterans gathered, close arms thrown casually over each other's shoulders, families moving in to stand beside them, the children weaving their way to the front. Chuck stood slightly to the side, but the organizer reached out, pulling him gently into the center, his arm resting across Chuck's back. The girl counted softly. 1, 2, 3. The camera's shutter clicked. The image it captured would sit framed on a local community center wall, not because it marked a victory, but because it marked something even rarer. a moment when people chose to stand together to see each other, to remember. Chuck left the gathering quietly afterward, his steps slow but steady, as he made his way down the path toward home. No headlines waited for him now, no flashing cameras, no loud applause, only the soft glow of the setting sun, the faint echo of shared laughter behind him, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the greatest change comes not from one man's story, but from the ripple it leaves behind. There was no next chapter waiting. No sequel, just the simple, lasting truth. No one should have to stand alone, and no one should ever be forgotten. Not everyone wearing an old jacket is broken. Not everyone sitting quietly in the corner is weak. And not everyone struggling to make ends meet is invisible. Chuck Evans never wanted the spotlight. He never asked for the attention, the headlines, or the applause. All he ever wanted was to live his days with dignity, to stand on his own feet, and to make sure no one around him was left unseen. When the cameras faded and the headlines moved on, Chuck remained steady. He didn't chase interviews or bask in the sudden fame. Instead, he focused on helping those who walked the same quiet road he had traveled, the veterans in the shelters, the men and women with calloused hands and weary eyes, the invisible shoulders carrying burdens no one else saw. He knew the truth, that many forget. Respect is not handed out because of medals or titles. It is not measured by how loudly you demand it or how many people are watching. True respect is earned every day in the quiet moments when no one is keeping score. It is found in the way we see each other, listen to each other, and stand beside each other, especially when the world is too busy to care. Chuck's story is not a fairy tale. He did not win a prize that solved everything. His battles didn't magically end, nor did the struggles of those around him vanish overnight. But what changed was this. People started to notice. One by one, small circles of awareness began to ripple outward. A neighbor offered help to a struggling veteran. A teacher invited a quiet voice into the conversation. A community opened its eyes just a little wider. That's the power of one person standing up, not for fame but for what's right. It isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing. Even when you are afraid, Chuck knew fear. He knew pain, loss, rejection, but he also knew patience, persistence, and the simple, stubborn courage of showing up anyway. There are thousands of Chuck Evans out there, men and women who sit on park benches, who stand in line at grocery stores, who walk past you on busy sidewalks, unnoticed, unrecognized, unacknowledged. They carry stories you will never hear unless you take the time to look, to ask, to care. If you cross paths with someone like Chuck, don't turn away. Don't dismiss them as just another stranger fading into the background. Pause. See them, stand beside them if you can listen, even when the words are hard or the silence is long, because respect does not come from ceremonies or speeches. It comes from how we treat one another when there are no cameras, no crowds, no rewards waiting at the end. It comes from the quiet choice to see someone fully, not as a problem, not as a symbol, but as a person who deserves to be known, to be valued, to be remembered. Chuck Evans' chapter closes not with a dramatic ending or a grand finale, but with a quiet truth that lingers long after the story fades. We do not honor the forgotten by speaking their names. Once, we honor them by making sure they are never forgotten again. So carry this lesson forward wherever you are, whoever you meet. Watch for the quiet ones. Stand beside the overlooked. Share the space with those who carry more than they show. Because at the end of the day, dignity is not a prize handed out to the lucky few. It is a birthright we all share, and a responsibility we all carry. Not every hero wears a uniform now. Some heroes sit quietly at coffee shops, help others in the shadows, or plant seeds of hope in the next generation. Their names may never trend, their faces may never fill the news, but they are there shaping the world in ways that truly matter. And if you remember nothing else, remember this: respect isn't about the moment people are watching. It's about the moment no one is. It's about the quiet choice to do what's right, simply because it's right. That is the legacy Chuck Evans leaves behind. Not a headline, not a medal, not a story that demands a sequel, just a truth carried forward one person at a time. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Chuck Evans's journey reminds us that some of the most powerful changes in this world happen quietly, without applause, without cameras, and often without anyone even noticing. It's a reminder that strength is not measured by medals, but by the courage to stand for what's right, even when you're standing alone. So here's a question for you. Have you ever met someone like Chuck in your own life? Someone who quietly makes the world better without needing recognition? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story moved you, if you believe in honoring the unseen heroes among us, please like this video, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that shine a light on the quiet, powerful truths often left in the shadows. Together, let's make sure no one who deserves to be seen is ever left invisible again.